People venture into the wilderness for various reasons, whether to immerse themselves in nature, escape the stresses of urban life, or seek adventure and exploration. While these motivations are valid, the tranquility of camping can quickly shatter when wild animals, such as grizzly bears, enter the scene. Join us as we recount the tragic story of how a vibrant camp was disrupted by a grizzly attack, resulting in the loss of lives among nature enthusiasts. The evening of September 3, 2024, was calm in an isolated Russian campground near Kamchatka. The sun had already slipped beneath the horizon, casting a deep blue over the landscape. Sparse clusters of tents dotted the grassy clearings, nestled against the looming trees of the surrounding forest. Among the campers was a young Irish couple, Niamh and Kieran, who had chosen this remote place to escape into nature's solitude. They had just returned from a short evening hike and were now savoring the simplicity of their meal by the glow of their campfire. As the night settled, the air grew calmer, and the couple could feel a deepening silence surrounding them. The forest was mostly quiet, with only faint rustlings now and then as nocturnal creatures stirred in the distance. In the middle of this tranquility, however, lurked a presence neither of them could have anticipated. Somewhere not far from the campground, a grizzly bear was prowling, likely on the hunt for food. Driven by the hunger that often set in with the impending winter, it was drawn toward the scent of human presence, a smell entwined with faint traces of food, warmth, and vulnerability. Around the campsite, other campers had settled in for the night as well. Conversations had slowed to murmurs, and shadows flickered across tent walls, cast by the last remaining embers of their fires. Niamh and Kieran were among the last to stay up, their laughter a soft, distant echo among the trees. They knew bears inhabited the area, but like most campers, they had grown confident that the bear deterrents scattered around the site, bear spray, food stored in canisters, and loud noises when needed, would be enough. No one anticipated what was about to unfold. As the bear approached the perimeter of the campground, its instincts honed in on the young couple's campsite. Niamh noticed a movement out of the corner of her eye and squinted into the shadows. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, a trick of the darkness. But soon she saw the shape, broad and dark, lumbering towards them, its bulk unmistakable. She nudged Kieran, a tremor in her voice as she pointed. He turned, his body stiffening as he registered the grizzly's size, its sharp, unblinking gaze focused intently on them. Both knew that if they made the wrong move, things could go terribly wrong. They sprang into action, standing up and waving their arms, shouting in deep voices as they'd read to do, trying to make themselves appear more prominent. But the bear didn't back down. Its posture was different, not curious, not tentative, but driven and unwavering. There was a savage hunger in its approach, a primal intensity that went beyond ordinary bear behavior. They could sense it, and their fear deepened as it continued advancing, now only a few yards away. In desperation, Kieran grabbed a nearby pan and clanged it against a rock, the noise cutting through the stillness of the night. The bear hesitated, but only for a moment. As if something snapped within it, the grizzly lunged forward, closing the remaining distance between them with a speed and force neither could have anticipated. Panic surged as Niamh and Kieran tried to scramble away, but the bear was on them, its massive paws striking with terrifying precision and strength. Nearby campers, awakened by the commotion, scrambled out of their tents, horrified by the scene before them. Some shouted and waved flashlights, trying to divert the bear's attention, but the chaos only seemed to escalate the grizzly's aggression. It was now fully locked in a frenzy, thrashing and mauling, as campers stood helplessly, torn between wanting to help and the paralyzing fear of becoming the next target. In mere minutes, Niamh and Kieran's struggle came to a devastating end as the bear's brutal attack left them fatally injured. As the reality of what had happened set in, silence fell over the campground. Some campers were crying, others pacing back and forth in a daze, struggling to process the nightmarish event. The Grizzly, perhaps startled by the sudden quiet and the lights flickering toward it, finally retreated into the shadows of the forest, leaving behind a scene of horror. Soon the authorities arrived, alerted by a frantic emergency call from one of the campers who had managed to get enough reception to place it. They were met with faces pale with shock, eyes filled with horror, and bodies trembling as they tried to recount the attack. Many were too shaken to speak, still trapped in the paralysis of what they had witnessed. A few had retreated into their tents, unable to bear the sight of the aftermath. The investigators, experienced as they were with the realities of the wild, looked solemn as they examined the campsite, piecing together the final moments of Neve and Kyron's lives. They understood that grizzly bears could be unpredictable, mainly when they were hungry or felt their territory threatened. Still, something was chilling in the thought that the attack had been so unprovoked, so unstoppable. For the campers who survived, the night left an indelible scar. Sleep became elusive, and the sounds of the forest, once comforting, now felt ominous. The scent of smoke, the silhouette of trees, and the very sight of a tent, all once symbols of freedom and peace, were now forever tainted by the memory of that night. In the days that followed, the campground remained closed, and a search was launched to locate the bear responsible. Park officials and wildlife specialists debated the following steps, balancing conservation needs with public safety. Experts weighed in on the bear's behavior, speculating that an unusually harsh summer or a lack of food sources might have driven it to such extreme aggression. Meanwhile, news of the tragedy spread, sparking conversations on wildlife safety and human encroachment into natural habitats. But for those who had been at the campground that night, the discussions felt distant and academic. The pain they carried was personal and raw. Each time they closed their eyes, they could see flashes of the attack, hear the echoes of Kieran's desperate attempts to defend Neve, and feel the weight of their helplessness. In Ireland, the young couple's families mourned their demise, grappling with grief and disbelief. The finality of what had happened in that remote part of Russia felt unreal, like a tragic story that had somehow intruded into their lives. They received condolences from strangers and messages of sympathy from those who had also ventured into the wild seeking peace, only to return with stories that hinted at nature's darker side. The Siberian wilderness lay beneath a heavy blanket of snow, its treacherous expanse obscured by a thick gray sky. A group of seasoned skiers, Leonti, Angelica, Sergei, and Mikhail, had journeyed far to experience the raw isolation and pristine slopes of this remote landscape. Despite their extensive outdoor experience, they were unprepared for the challenges Siberia would present. What began as a gentle snowfall transformed into a fierce blizzard by midday, reducing visibility to mere meters and making the terrain difficult. As they struggled against the biting wind, the group found themselves stranded, with little choice but to seek shelter. Just as despair began to set in, Sergei spotted a small, crooked cabin in the distance. Though abandoned and weather-beaten, it offered a refuge from the relentless storm. Once inside, they quickly set about sealing any gaps to block the frigid wind, layering spare clothing along the cracks to fortify their makeshift sanctuary. As night fell, the temperature inside the cabin remained barely tolerable. Wrapped in layers and rationing their limited supplies, they dozed restlessly, listening to the wind howl outside. It was then that Angelica, shifting closer to the door to investigate a draft, noticed something chilling. In the dim light of her headlamp, massive paw prints stood clearly pressed into the snow just outside the door. The size of the prints alone indicated a bear, and from the depth and proximity of the tracks, it wasn't a bear that had just wandered past. It had lingered. Angelica's heart pounded as she pointed the tracks out to the others, who had now gathered near the door, their breaths fogging up in the frigid air. Bears were not uncommon in Siberia, but one this close in the dead of winter, hungry and possibly enraged, was a different threat altogether. They'd all heard stories of how bears, starving after a long winter's hibernation, could go to desperate lengths for food. The sense of security they'd briefly felt in the cabin dissolved into dread. They could see faint movement in the shadows beyond the cabin, and Leonti shushed the others, his face pale with the realization that this wasn't a random encounter. Not long after, a heavy thud against the door sent splinters flying. The massive and ragged bear had begun ramming the door with brutal force. The skiers scrambled, looking for any makeshift barricades, anything to strengthen the thin door now bearing the brunt of the beast's desperate onslaught. They stacked their skis, poles, and even some loose timber from the walls in front of the door, hoping to reinforce it. But with each impact, the door groaned, its hinges whining against the strain. The night grew colder, and every strike from the bear shook the cabin. They could feel the structure weakening, the walls trembling with each thunderous push. The bear's growls rumbled through the planks, a haunting sound that cut through the storm's noise, mingling with the wind. Its hunger was evident in its relentless attack, and the skiers' resolve was stretched as thin as the fragile walls that surrounded them. The group's supplies were dangerously low. They had a few energy bars, some jerky, and a handful of trail mix that wouldn't sustain them for long. They began rationing sips of water, each person measuring out enough to moisten their lips, hoping it would last until morning when they could reassess their situation. Hours passed in this grim stalemate, and the bear showed no signs of surrender. Desperate, Leonti took a hunting knife from his pack, its blade dull but strong. He wasn't sure if it would help, but it was the only weapon they had. The others, watching his determination, checked their gear, searching for anything sharp or heavy that could act as a defense if the bear finally broke through. The storm finally subsided as dawn approached, but the bear's fury only grew. A final devastating impact sent the door off its hinges, and a wave of frigid air filled the cabin as the bear forced its way inside. Panic surged through the group, their instincts quickening to survival mode. Sergei lunged forward with a ski pole, jabbing it into the bear's muzzle, hoping to startle it back. The bear roared in anger, swiping at the pole, splintering it with terrifying ease. Mikhail and Angelica backed up toward the rear wall, trying to stay out of reach, as Leonti, clutching his knife, edged toward the bear's flank. The bear, gaunt and ravenous, swiveled its attention between the threats, its bloodshot eyes wild with hunger. Leonti took advantage of its momentary confusion, plunging the knife into the beast's shoulder with all his strength. The bear shrieked a guttural sound of pain and fury, whipping its massive head toward him and swiping him back with a force that sent him sprawling. Seizing the moment, Sergei and Angelica grabbed whatever they could, a piece of firewood, the shattered remnants of a ski, and pressed forward, jabbing at the bear, trying to drive it back outside. Bleeding, furious, but now sensing the resistance from the humans, the bear hesitated, taking a staggering step backward. Another desperate shove from the group finally forced it out of the cabin. They slammed the door shut as best they could, barricading it with their weight, listening as the bear snarled and pounded outside. The hours dragged on, the bear's noises gradually fading as it retreated, exhausted and injured, back into the wilderness. By morning, the cabin was silent. The skiers, bruised, exhausted, and cold beyond comprehension, took stock of the damage. The supplies were all but gone, and the cabin was torn and barely able to shelter them further. Leonti, though bruised, was alive, thanks to the group's quick thinking. They knew they couldn't wait for help. They'd have to move before hunger and cold claimed them. Each skier wore a new layer of resilience, the kind forged by the raw terror of survival. They salvaged what they could from the ruined cabin and set out, their eyes sharp, their every step calculated. The path back was uncertain, but the fear was gone. They had survived a trial few could even imagine, outlasting the storm and facing down one of nature's fiercest predators. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air as a search and rescue team ventured into the dense boreal forests of northern Canada. Snow clung to the branches, casting a silvery light that filtered through the canopy. Led by Lachlan Mercier, a seasoned specialist with 20 years of experience in the rugged north, the team felt an urgent pressure. Two hikers, Judith and Emile Gagnon, had been missing for 3 days, and with dropping temperatures and a brewing storm, every second counted. Their path was challenging, winding through steep terrain and rocky outcrops. Thick, moss-covered trunks loomed around them, while tangled underbrush snagged their feet. Signs of human activity emerged. Torn gloves, scrunched maps, and footprints leading deeper into the forest. Yet unsettling markers also appeared. Claw marks on trees, fresh scat, and tufts of fur caught on branches. A grizzly bear had recently passed through, its presence looming like a shadow. Lachlan reminded the team to stay vigilant, balancing respect for nature with their mission. As fatigue set in, their resolve only deepened. They couldn't abandon Judith and Emile, who were likely injured or lost. Lachlan and his team, Dawson, Coralie, and Michel, moved forward in near silence, fully aware of the potential risks. They pressed forward, hoping they were close. Just as they entered a small clearing, however, a shiver of tension rippled through the group. The ground was littered with fresh paw prints the size of dinner plates, unmistakable evidence of a grizzly in the vicinity. The bear's presence was tangible, and a sense of dread settled upon them, as if the very air had thickened. They slowed, each footfall deliberate, every breath measured. Lachlan's mind raced, assessing potential routes of retreat. He knew that encountering a grizzly in its territory was akin to treading on a razor's edge. Any misstep could prove fatal. Suddenly, a low rumble rolled across the clearing, sending a shockwave of fear through the team. Emerging from the shadows, a massive grizzly appeared in its bulk, a terrifying testament to the raw power of nature. Its eyes held an unsettling intelligence, cold and unblinking, sizing them up as it sniffed the air, the scent of humans intruding on its space. The bear reared on its hind legs, towering over them, each claw glistening like a dagger. For a brief moment, there was a terrible silence as the team locked eyes with the animal, a silent understanding that the forest's rules would now dictate their fate. In the tense silence that followed, the bear's instincts took over. It charged, a dark blur moving with impossible speed. The team scattered, each member instinctively diving for cover, but the bear's attention zeroed in on Michel, whose movements had drawn its gaze. Lachlan's heart pounded as he saw Michel stumble, the young man's face frozen in terror. Before he could act, the bear was upon Michel, its immense weight crashing down on him. A sickening crunch echoed through the clearing as Michel's legs snapped under the bear's paw. He screamed, the sound sharp and desperate, cutting through the frigid air. Coralie, trained to remain calm under pressure, rushed forward, brandishing her flare gun in a last-ditch effort to deter the bear. She fired, the burst of light and heat startling the grizzly momentarily, causing it to retreat several paces. The bear hesitated, seemingly torn between fleeing and continuing its attack. In those precious seconds, Dawson managed to drag Michel to relative safety behind a fallen tree. Lachlan's mind was racing, torn between returning to help Michel and ensuring the team's survival. The search for Judith and Emile felt impossibly distant now, as the grim reality of their survival took precedence. Michel's injury was severe, his leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and the bone likely shattered. Coralie assessed his wounds, her face pale but composed as she worked to stem the bleeding. She glanced at Lachlan, her expression a mixture of determination and silent appeal. They both understood the gravity of the situation. Michael couldn't walk, and any further attempt to carry him would not only slow them down but also risk attracting the bear's attention again. Lachlan weighed their options, his mind teetering on the edge of an impossible choice. Abandoning Michael, even in the name of survival, was unthinkable. Yet pressing on with a severely injured member could jeopardize everyone. The decision felt as heavy as the forest pressing down around them. Lachlan's gaze drifted to the faint trail left by the missing hikers, a path now barely visible in the dimming light. Judith and Emil were still out there, somewhere beyond this clearing, possibly clinging to life, hoping that someone would find them. But here was Michelle, someone they had a duty to protect, lying helpless and in pain. The line between rescuer and victim had blurred to the point where they were indistinguishable. After a heavy silence, Lachlan made the call. The search for Judith and Emil would have to wait. The lives of those in his immediate care took precedence, and he couldn't, in good conscience, press on while Michael's life hung in the balance. They began their retreat, Dawson and Lachlan taking turns carrying Michelle, each step more grueling than the last. The injured man's muffled groans underscored the gravity of their situation, his pain a constant reminder of the razor-thin line they walked. The journey back was tense. Every snapping twig and distant rustle amplified and heightened their senses to an unbearable degree. Lachlan replayed the encounter with the bear in his mind, questioning every decision and move. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. Had he led them too deep into the wilderness? Was abandoning the search the right choice? After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the forest's edge, where civilization met the wild. Relief washed over them, mingled with exhaustion and unspoken grief. They radioed for help, and soon, a medical team arrived to whisk Michelle away. Lachlan watched as his injured comrade disappeared, feeling guilt mixed with relief. He knew their retreat had likely saved Michelle's life, but the fate of Judith and Emil loomed as a haunting uncertainty. Days later, standing at the forest's edge, Lachlan couldn't shake the ghosts lingering among the trees. The forest had demanded a price, forcing him to trade his hope of finding Judith and Emil for the safety of those he could save. The burden of that choice would linger, a reminder that in the wild, the line between savior and survivor often blurs. Dr. Ethan Carden was familiar with the rugged beauty of the Alaskan wilderness. For nearly 2 decades, he had dedicated himself to studying wildlife, exploring habitats worldwide, and uncovering the mysteries of animal behavior. Now, he was in Alaska, tracking grizzly bears for a documentary aimed at showcasing the delicate balance between these magnificent creatures and their environment. The Alaskan wilderness offered one of the few remaining sanctuaries where grizzlies roamed freely, and capturing the life cycles of these bears, especially the protective nature of mother bears, was vital to his mission. One brisk morning, with the air rich in the scent of damp earth, Ethan set out with his heavy camera equipment, his constant companion. He spent hours observing bears from a distance, documenting their foraging and hunting habits. For him, this work was a reverent calling. He believed that sharing the raw, unfiltered lives of these animals could foster a deeper respect for nature. On this particular day, he stumbled upon a mother bear with her 2 playful cubs in a secluded meadow, surrounded by pine trees. Ethan knew the risks of approaching a mother with cubs. Years of experience had taught him to respect their boundaries. Yet, the serene scene before him beckoned. As the cubs tumbled around their mother, he felt compelled to move closer for the perfect shot. In his eagerness, he accidentally stepped on a patch of dry twigs, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Instantly, the mother bear's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as she locked onto him. Ethan's heart raced. Instinct screamed at him to back away slowly, but before he could react, she charged. Her sheer size and speed were terrifying. Despite his training, he felt primal fear surging within him, the realization that he was facing a force far beyond his control. He tried to appear non-threatening, his voice trembling as he spoke softly, but she was unwavering, a mother protecting her cubs at all costs. In the final moments before impact, he dropped to the ground, covering his neck with his hands, mentally preparing for the brutal force he knew was about to strike. The bear collided with him like a runaway freight train, and the initial strike knocked the wind from his lungs. Sharp claws raked across his back, tearing through layers of clothing and biting into his skin. The pain was instant, blinding, but he forced himself to stay still. He knew any attempt to flee or fight back would only provoke a deadlier response. The world was reduced to the thud of his heartbeat, the sound of her heavy breaths, and the tearing pain as her claws found flesh again. Ethan's mind oscillated between fear and focus. He reminded himself of everything he knew about bear behavior, clinging to his training. Don't move. Protect the neck. Stay down. The bear's hot breath washed over him, her powerful jaws grazing his shoulder, and he braced himself for the worst. But as quickly as it began, it ended. The bear retreated, her attention drawn back to her cubs, who were now huddled close to her, watching with wide eyes. She let out a low grunt, a warning as if to say that he had been spared this time. For a long time, Ethan lay still, scarcely believing that the attack was over. His body ached, his skin raw where her claws had torn through it. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up, wincing at every movement. Blood seeped through his shredded clothing, and his breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps. He was hurt. Badly, he knew that much. But he couldn't afford to dwell on the pain. The mother bear hadn't gone far. She lingered at the edge of the meadow, watching him with an unwavering gaze, a reminder of the line he had crossed and the price she was willing to exact. Alone and injured, Ethan took a deep, steadying breath, forcing his mind to focus on survival. He needed to put distance between himself and the bear, but his body protested every step. The wilderness he had revered now seemed vast and indifferent, its silence almost mocking as he stumbled forward, his every movement a reminder of his vulnerability. The adrenaline that had carried him through the attack faded, replaced by a profound weariness. He moved carefully, eyes darting to every shadow, his instincts on high alert. Navigating the rough terrain with his injuries was a grueling ordeal. Each step sent fresh jolts of pain radiating through his body, but he pressed on, knowing he had no other choice. His body was weakened, and his vision blurred, but his survival instincts kept him moving. Hours passed, the sun dipping lower in the sky as he stumbled through dense thickets and across rocky clearings. Occasionally, he glanced back, half expecting to see the mother bear following him. But she remained in the distance, her presence a constant, silent threat. Finally, as dusk settled over the wilderness, he reached a familiar landmark, a craggy outcrop he recognized from his journey into the meadow. Relief mingled with exhaustion as he knew he was close to his camp. Every step towards safety felt like a victory, each breath a reminder of how close he had come to losing it all. When he finally reached his camp, Ethan collapsed onto the ground, his body sagging under the weight of exhaustion and injury. He felt the familiar ache of survival, the raw reminder of the risks inherent in his work. The attack had left scars, both visible and invisible, but it also reinforced the reverence he held for the creatures he studied. In the end, he understood that his years of experience and knowledge had not made him invincible. Instead, they had equipped him to endure, to respect the wild for the force it was, unpredictable, powerful, and ultimately indifferent to human presence. As he lay there under the vast Alaskan sky, He knew he had faced the thin line between admiration and survival. He had come to the wilderness to capture the beauty of these creatures, but in doing so, he had been reminded of the harsh reality that respect must always be tempered with caution in the wild. Derek had been planning this trip for months, counting down the days to escape the bustle of city life and immerse themselves in the raw beauty of an expansive national park. For Alaric and Sable Derek, the trip promised a chance to reconnect as a family and introduce their children, 12-year-old Ida and 10-year-old Rowan, to the wonder of nature. Early October had painted the landscape in a golden tapestry, the towering pines contrasting sharply with vibrant patches of aspen. This day was meant to be a peaceful culmination of their adventure, a perfect day in the wild. As they drove down winding roads surrounded by dense woods, the family was taken by the serenity and vastness of the park. When they reached a popular picnic area near a meadow, the setting felt too idyllic to pass by. Ignoring the posted warning signs about recent bear sightings, they parked the car and unloaded their supplies. Alaric glanced at the warnings but thought little of them. He'd assumed that, as long as they kept to themselves, any wildlife would remain distant. He reassured Sable with a quick smile, his confidence unfazed by the precautions they might have taken. While the children explored the surroundings, laughing as they snapped photos of each other near the trees and a nearby stream, Alaric and Sable set out a spread of sandwiches, snacks, and drinks. The faint scent of smoked ham and chips wafted into the air, mingling with the earthy fragrance of the forest. The children joined their parents, and together they posed for pictures with the scenic backdrop, their faces bright with happiness, oblivious to the unseen dangers lurking just beyond. But nature is not bound by human intentions or expectations. In the shadowed woods nearby, a grizzly bear had caught the scent of their meal. The bear had been foraging along the meadow's edge, driven by the urgency of preparing for winter. It moved with stealth, drawn to the source of the enticing smells wafting through the trees, its senses acutely attuned to the prospect of an easy meal. Within moments, it had caught sight of the family, watching them from the cover of trees, invisible to their carefree, unsuspecting eyes. Suddenly, the grizzly emerged from the trees, and a massive, lumbering figure sent a shock through Alaric and Sable. They froze for a moment, paralyzed by the sheer size and presence of the beast. It was no small creature, but a full-grown grizzly, with fur bristling and powerful limbs built for survival in the harshest of terrains. Its eyes locked onto the food laid out on the table, but it was fully aware of the family between it and the source of the scent. Driven by hunger and instinct, the bear advanced, a rumbling growl building within its chest. In that instant, instinct took over. Alaric moved to stand between the bear and his children, bracing his body in a vain attempt to shield them. Sable grabbed Ida and Rowan, pushing them behind her, every fiber of her being focused on protecting them. The bear charged forward, a thunderous mass of muscle and weight. Alaric shouted, hoping to scare it off, but the bear was unfazed and relentless in its approach. Within seconds, the distance between man and beast was reduced to nothing. The bear struck with terrifying speed, its massive paws bearing down on Alaric. He fought, using his arms to shield himself, but he was hopelessly outmatched. Sable screamed, watching helplessly as the bear's strength overwhelmed him. Alaric's figure buckled under the weight of the grizzly's assault, and before Sable could pull the children further away, the bear turned its focus to her. She tried to shield them, standing as their last line of defense, but the bear's assault was swift and merciless, her final moments an echo of her love and desperate attempts to protect. Ida and Rowan huddled together, unable to comprehend the horror unfolding before them, and remained frozen in terror. A blur of sounds filled the air, the desperate cries of their parents, the guttural roars of the bear, and the snapping of branches as it moved. The children could do nothing but cling to each other, their young minds reeling in shock, unable to process the magnitude of the violence or the finality of what they were witnessing. By the time the rangers arrived, alerted by other park visitors who heard the commotion, it was too late. The bear had already retreated, having claimed its meal. The rangers approached cautiously, assessing the tragic scene, their expressions somber. The surviving children were found in a state of stunned silence, clinging to each other amidst the scattered remains of their picnic. The rangers knew well the risks of the park's wildlife, but the brutal reality of those risks was something even they struggled to face at that moment. In the days that followed, Ida and Rowan were engulfed in a grief that felt endless, haunted by the final moments of their parents' lives. Once cherished memories of their trip became painful, each tied to an overwhelming sense of guilt. Ida, older, agonized over their choices. Why hadn't they left sooner? Could a different decision have saved them? Rowan, though younger, bore his burden, as if his survival came at a terrible cost. Back home, condolences from family and friends offered little comfort. The park, once a place of joy, was now marred in their minds as a symbol of terror and loss. Therapy became routine, but healing was slow, tangled with memories they couldn't escape. In quiet moments, Ida felt anger toward nature itself, now seen as indifferent and dangerous. Rowan wrestled with a painful awareness of mortality. Over time, they learned to live with their grief, though it left a permanent mark. The tragedy became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the respect owed to nature's unpredictable power. A lesson Ida and Rowan understood all too well. Victor Hale was no stranger to the hunt. He had tracked lions through the dusty savannas of Tanzania and stalked elk across the snow-crusted Rockies. But this trip to Romania's Carpathian Mountains, where dense forests veiled treacherous terrain, offered a challenge he hadn't yet conquered. The elusive Eurasian brown bear. The bears in these mountains were fabled creatures, massive and fierce, a relic of ancient Europe. To Victor, they represented the apex predator he was determined to outwit and claim as his own, another trophy to adorn his study wall. Armed with the latest high-powered rifle, thermal scopes, and a rangefinder, he was confident he could outmaneuver any threat the wilderness had to offer. The air was sharp and heavy with the scent of pine as he began his trek, a weighty mist blanketing the ground. Despite the isolation, Victor moved with the assuredness of someone who trusted his prowess implicitly. Every step felt calculated, every decision instinctual. His path wound through gorges and around towering fir trees, his senses tuned to every subtle noise, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant croak of a raven, the whisper of the wind. To him, each sound held a clue, each trail a promise of his quarry. Days passed with no sight of his target. The Carpathians were unforgiving, their sheer cliffs and dense underbrush making it nearly impossible to move quietly or quickly. But Victor welcomed the challenge. He wore his resilience like armor, his equipment like an extension of himself. He knew the bear was out there. He'd seen scat, paw prints as large as his hand, and claw marks etched into tree trunks. With each sign, he felt a surge of anticipation. He was close. So close. On the fourth day at dawn, Victor finally caught sight of the bear. It was gargantuan, its thick brown fur rippling as it moved silently through the fog, its muscles shifting beneath the coat like coiled cables. Victor's pulse quickened, adrenaline sharpening his senses. From his position atop a slight incline, he lined up his shot, fingers steady, eyes narrowed. He calculated the distance, adjusted for wind, and locked his rifle's crosshairs onto the beast's chest. He squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the silence, a violent tear against the serene backdrop of the mountains. The bear staggered, a low, guttural roar escaping its maw as it stumbled forward. Victor's eyes lit with fierce satisfaction. But then, as the mist began to clear, he saw it. The bear was not down. The bullet had only grazed it, tearing through muscle but missing vital organs. Instead of fleeing, it locked eyes with him, a fury burning in its gaze that even Victor hadn't anticipated. And then, the beast charged. Victor cursed under his breath, frantically cycling another round into the chamber. He aimed again, but this time his hands trembled. The bear moved faster than he'd ever seen such a massive creature move. There was no time for precision. He fired another round, but the shot went wide, shattering a tree branch. Victor's confidence cracked as he realized his mistake. A wounded predator was far more dangerous than a healthy one. He'd wanted a trophy, but now he'd become prey. With no other choice, Victor turned and ran, his once calm and calculated pace now a desperate sprint. He knew the forest well enough to avoid steep drops and tangled roots, but the bear pursued him relentlessly. Each roar echoed through the valleys, a reminder that his every misstep could be his last. Hours passed as he ran, slipped, and stumbled, his heavy equipment now a burden weighing him down, his heart hammering in his chest. Exhausted, he abandoned his rifle, its weight dragging him further into fatigue. His thermal scope, useless in daylight and without power, was left behind soon after. All the tools he had trusted became worthless in the face of raw, unyielding nature. As the chase continued, Victor's mind slipped into primal survival. He discarded his GPS and dug his hands into the earth, following game trails and scent trails like an animal himself. The wind became his ally, carrying the scent of moss and wet soil, guiding him toward potential shelter. He climbed boulders and crawled under dense thickets, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the bear. But every so often, he'd hear the crack of branches or catch a glimpse of fur through the trees, reminding him that the predator was always close behind. Time blurred as he stumbled through the wilderness, his body bruised, clothes torn, and the cold biting through his bones. Hunger gnawed at him, and he ate roots, berries, and whatever he could scavenge. He was far from the man who had marched confidently into the Carpathians, his every fiber now dedicated to survival, his mind focused only on the next hour, the next hiding place. The forest, once a mere backdrop to his hunt, became a menacing labyrinth. Finally, on the 5th day, Victor reached a small clearing by a stream. His body, weakened from hunger and exhaustion, collapsed near the water's edge. He cupped the freezing water with his trembling hands, savoring each sip as though it were his last. But he knew he couldn't stay here for long. His instincts told him the bear was near. He sensed it, a presence that loomed over the landscape, filling every silence with a latent threat. Night descended, and Victor huddled in the shadows listening. He heard the soft pad of paws somewhere in the darkness, the crackle of dry twigs snapping underweight. His heart raced as he felt the presence draw closer, circling him like a phantom, patient and relentless. The balance of power had shifted. He was no longer the master of his fate, but a helpless creature at the mercy of an ancient predator. The final confrontation came swiftly. As dawn's light began to creep over the horizon, Victor saw the bear emerge from the shadows, its fur matted, its eyes gleaming with the wrath he had kindled. His hands, numb and empty, could only clutch at rocks and branches as makeshift weapons. The bear advanced, the ground shuddering with each step, and Victor knew he could do nothing to stop it. He felt the air grow heavy, the weight of his mortality pressing down as he braced for the inevitable. When the dawn finally broke, silence fell over the mountains. The forest had reclaimed Victor, his presence vanishing into the vast, indifferent wilderness. The bear's rage subsided and it retreated into the trees, leaving no trace of the struggle save for a few scattered pieces of Victor's equipment and the faint imprint of its colossal paws. In the end, the mountains endured, timeless and implacable, while Victor's fate became another untold story, whispered by the wind through the Carpathians.